Thank you for inviting us. It was the first time you stepped into a UU congregation, or maybe you were born into one. A friend told you about a place that seemed to take all the barbed wire of false theology and hypocrisy out of the doorway. Your theology, the way you spoke it and lived it, could be out of the closet. And so could your gay friends and your trans friends and almost any friends you might ever meet. It wasn't a perfect place, but religious communities should always have some good work left to do on themselves, just like religious communities should always have a little bit of debt to pay off, just to prove that they aren't playing it too safe. Not yet. So you liked this place. You watched from the outside for a while just to make sure they were the real deal, and then you started to get connected. Maybe you just dove right in. You saw some warts, you still find some from time to time, but you see depth and deepening, and you love the premise. You love that this love that should always widen its embrace until everyone's inside it, and this unity, this belief that the force that underlies all of creation pulls us into one created family. You love that we're called to imitate that. This universalist love and Unitarian unity. Interdependent web of all existence of which we are but a part, free and responsible, search for truth and meaning, free but responsible to act into the truths we find. Justice, peace. Democratic means compassion and mutual support for each other's spiritual growth. You were hooked. If you were lucky enough to be born into this faith, you got steeped in it from the cradle. Spirit of life. You sang it with Yankee Doodle Dandy and roots and wings and our whole lives matter. Chalice children. And then you wanted others to have it. Just last week, a member of the church in Summit in New Jersey, where I minister, she and I were paired with another couple from a nearby town to go and visit and talk to one of our representatives to the state assembly, because we wanted to lobby this woman, our assemblywoman, to override the governor's veto on marriage equality in our state when it got brought up for a vote. In our preparations, the couple, two women, talked about being one of the few out lesbian couples in their town, and they talked also about how recently, when their Presbyterian church finally moved to allow gay and lesbian folks to be deacons, how the church rushed to anoint them into that office. Talked about how loved they were in that place. And they must just be dying to celebrate your wedding when we get marriage equality here in New Jersey, I said, like a naive fool. No, they said quietly, our church doesn't allow the marriage of two women. I could hardly contain my dismay and sympathetic pain. We forget. Not that we're angels, but we forget what we offer in so many ways. Well, we want to celebrate with you. I wanted to say, we'll dance with you down the church aisle. But of course they knew that from my question and my answer. The world is ready for us. Spiritual but not religious folk are on the rise. The nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those who check none as their religious affiliation, they are on the rise. Those folks who say they have no religious affiliation still want something. They just want something that doesn't live a narrow, homophobic sense of what it means to be spiritual, that affirms first-hand experiences of the holy or the divine as something true stubborn entrepreneurs of spiritual community, and generous investors of progressive life values. I had a member years ago tell me about a moment in his life. He was relatively young, in his mid-40s, and he got a horrible diagnosis, a scary one. And while he was in the hospital getting treatment, he said he had time to think, and it hit him how many of the things he had hoped to achieve in his life he had not yet done. And he thought about how he had lots of good reasons for why that was so. I mean, he'd been going to law school, and then he'd been building up his own firm, and then he had a small child, and then he was weathering a divorce. He had lots of very good excuses for why these things hadn't gotten done. But then he said he realized that in the end, all he might have were excuses. When his illness responded to treatment, he went at life with a focus and a passion that still has me in awe. He launched a nonprofit arm of his law firm. He called to find out how to do pro bono work for an organization in New Jersey that he'd always admired from the outside, and now he's on their board. He started a spiritual practice that he had once been exposed to and found resonant with his own spiritual path. He wrote a novel and then another, and he's working on his third, which features Unitarian Universalism. You might be interested to know. Life is complicated and not entirely under our control, is it? But we have to make of it something that answers for what we cherish. Something to show for what we came to believe was true and beautiful and good in this life. Something that we found worth growing and fiercely serving. I walked into a church years ago as a teenager, actually. A place where I found some of that. And a church that in the mid-'80s in New York City was putting up ads on New York City buses, right as the AIDS crisis was full of fear and misunderstanding, ads that said you could hug a person with AIDS, you could hold a person with AIDS, trying to build connection and erase fear. A congregation that years later, in a hot summer in New York, when a record number of children were killed by stray bullets while sleeping in their beds at night, started a partnership of faith with religious leaders of all denominations and religious affiliation called the Partnership for Faith in New York to try and work together to stem the violence in that city and restore faith in its civic life. Then when I came to Summit, we tried to do the same. I found a church that was trying to live into the same spirit we're talking about. A church that on its 100th anniversary decided to raise $100,000 to give away to those organizations that were serving education nationally and internationally. A stubbornness that had a congregation, that had a mission, say to itself, when the property next door came up for sale, that it thought it could buy on short notice. And in fact, in 2 weeks, the mortgage comes up for renegotiation. The building was $2.5 million, and we called someone who's head of stewardship who listened to our story and the timeline we had and said, and I think I quote, "Sometimes you have to let good opportunities pass." I think we have $34,000 more to pay off on $2.5 million. You know about faith and stubbornness. You all are the people who wanted to start a church in the 1940s or 50s and called the denomination and were told that you couldn't, and did it anyway? Call it a to church anyway. And you are the people who every winter, like you're preparing to, are going to open up your building every Sunday night to folks who otherwise would sleep outdoors in the woods without care or food or warmth or shelter. You are people of stubborn faith. And one more piece of evidence is the reason that we all are here today. Because you all are doing the crazy thing of calling a minister. And not only a minister, but one with a track record of big thinking, who also makes good on his promises. I know. I saw Jude at the RSCC, a regional subcommittee that sees people, 1-2 years into their training? All I could think when he left the room was, how the hell did I get through that process? He was intimidating then, and I swept in when all formal reviews were over like a viper and asked him if he would serve as our July minister. And when people found out that real church was actually happening, attendance rose to a 10-year record. So watch out, people. You read his packet. He's not joking, in all gentleness and soft manner aside. He thinks you want to do things. And he's taking you at your word. In fact, he started to tell me when we were talking about this day about what he'd been up to in about, 2 months that you've been on the job here. So I'm taking notes dutifully, just because I never know what it is that will stay with me. So I start to write it down: spirit in practice, pastoral care is up and functioning, mission and vision groups are convened, the leadership group is reading Alice Mann. I'm beginning to look at covenant with them. I finally stopped him. I was like, you don't actually have to do it all in the first year. It strikes me that this is all a bit like hiring a personal trainer. How it sounds really good until you're handing someone a check who has you aching and sweaty because they took you at your word that you wanted to get in shape. Well, I think you told him you wanted to get into spiritual shape, and you know what? Here you go, folks. Of course, it's actually great, as I'm sure you already know, and you'll love it, as I'm sure you already do, and you're never going to have to wonder for a moment whether what you're doing together is worthwhile or whether you'll have an impact. You'll see it and feel it, like I'm sure you already do. And you've no doubt felt it here before, which is why you were drawn to make sure that it happened again, and I predict this time it will happen on steroids. And this isn't the end, it's the beginning of the beginning. And all of us in this denomination have to cultivate some slightly different habits of the heart if we are going to do all the work we dream of doing. As I said in this year's General Assembly in Louisville, and I will say to you all here in case you missed it, we all are going to have to get crazy generous, is the way I put it. We're going to have to stop pretending that 1.5% of income is going to serve any but the sorriest of missions and the smallest of dreams. And right now, that's what our denomination gives on average of members. Because money isn't the most important thing, but it certainly matters. And we're going to have to stop being conveniently shy in the way that we talk about financial treasure, because that false modesty, in my experience, is most often a cover for being incredibly cheap, and we have to be done with being cheap. We're done. This year at General Assembly, what normally gets $30,000 for the fund you gave $60,000. We can do so much. And I would say you and I, we all have to get proper place. Not everything can be consensus-based or debated into perfection, because by the time we're done perfecting it, the mark has moved, right, in this world. So if we hope we're going to get anything done in a timely and relevant manner, we're going to have to figure out a slightly new way of doing things together, because the slow to move are going to die in our world, right? We see that all around. Just look at what religious communities are thriving and which ones are literally bleeding members. It's the fossilized ones who are bleeding members, right? The ones who can't remember how to stay limber and nimble and free and to take risks on behalf of mission. And we have to be able to take risks on behalf of mission. Which also means that you and I, we Unitarian Universalists, we're going to have to get good. We people are really good at figuring out how to do things right, but I think we're going to have to get good at realizing that in order to do that, we're going to stumble and make tons of mistakes, and that's completely okay, especially as we figure out what it means to do religion in this world that's changing so fast. Do you know, I heard recently that whereas a generation used to be 20 years, meaning a group of people, a cohort, that had a shared experience of life was 20 years, that now a generation is down to 6. So to figure out how to minister to generations is going to require us to be really fast learners and people willing to step into all sorts of places that we've never heard of or seen before. To stay alive and responsive, we're going to have to experiment, and that means we're going to make mistakes. And we're just going to have to learn to laugh as we do. Because we know why we're doing it, right? To serve our mission. The payoff for cultivating all these new habits of the heart is a religious community that actually sees results. And what are those results? They're nothing less than seeing everything we treasure sown into the world we leave behind. Policies that shape and support healthy human lives, things that heal and civilize and lift up the values that we adore, the values we loved when we found this place or loved from childhood in the place that we grew up in. Why would anyone live small when they could live into big love and the unity of all and see it made real before their eyes? Wasn't that the way that you felt when you first walked into a Unitarian Universalist congregation? Or when you realized that not everybody had been raised in this faith? Why would you live small? Why would you live into the lie that any of us should be less or stand by while anyone else is told they're less? And so the determination and the stubbornness and the dreams and the great work of our congregations, all of them were born in those places that we talk about. Boldness is in our blood. It's in our history. It's in our hearts. So to paraphrase the poet, excuse me for living, but since I am living, since we are living, given inches I take yards, taking yards, dream of miles, and a landscape unbounded and vast in abandon. You too are dreaming the same. So it's time to get to the work of our dreams, good people of Huntington. Install this minister and hold on tight to the reins, because the ride of